everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 21st, where I wanted to continue talking about the textbook readings and also remind you about your first speech, your autobiographical speech, which is going to be 5 minutes long, and that is going to be due on the 2nd of August on Tuesday. And thus far, I haven't heard from any of you expressing interest to present it live via Zoom. So if you are interested in presenting it live via Zoom, please contact me as soon as you can and let me know. If not, I'm assuming that the rest of you are going to be uploading your speech onto a speech number 1 folder that I will be adding when the time is appropriate. And what I'm going to be asking you to do is to, after all of the speeches have been uploaded, is to view your classmates' speeches and to send me some feedback privately of a positive and negative of each of the speeches. And then ultimately I will gather all of that together and present that to the class. But I'll give more information about that as we get a little bit closer to our first speech. So last class we were talking about thinking about getting started for that first speech, but also speeches in general, and thinking about your topic and making sure that you could refine your topic so that you could fit it into the time allotted. And we've got 5 minutes, and it doesn't have to be exactly down to the second, but you want it to be close because ultimately that's the commitment that you've made with your audience. So think about the length of the speech in terms of how much flexibility you might have with time. Obviously, an hour-long speech, you'll have much more flexibility with going over or under than you would have with a 5-minute speech. So as I was indicating last class, a 5-minute speech that's 10 minutes long, obviously you've gone over too much because you've gone over the length of the actual speech itself. But a 1-hour speech that goes over 5 minutes isn't necessarily that bad. So I wanted to talk about, now that you are grappling with your topic and some ideas of what it is you are going to be discussing, whether you're going to be giving a life overview and talking about some highlights, or you're going to be talking about a particular period or element of your life, or if you just feel more comfortable talking about education, whether it be what your past education was or your future educational goals are, or your present education and why you are in this particular class. You should be thinking about how to organize and outline those ideas that you are considering. So that's in chapter 7, and that's what I'll be talking about today, as well as the beginning and ending of speeches, which is chapter 8, and wording speeches, which is chapter 9. And the organizing and outlining is particularly important. Just the process of trying to organize and outline makes the speech easier for you to remember as a speaker when you are delivering it, and that makes it easier to present. It also makes you appear more credible when you are more comfortable with the information, and ultimately that makes your speech more persuasive. So there are lots of benefits to organizing and outlining. And you need to have a thesis, a central idea that your speech is going to be about. But as I oftentimes tell my English students, you might not necessarily know what your thesis is when you begin organizing, outlining, and drafting. Your thesis might develop over time. The idea is that by the ending, you know what your thesis is and you're able to incorporate that into the beginning of either it be your presentation or your paper. And then what you need to do is to try to figure out how you are going to organize your main points in the body. Because your speech is divided much like a paper: an introduction, a body, or as the Toastmasters video said, a discussion section, and finally a conclusion. So in terms of that body or discussion section, how are you going to organize your points? And my suspicion is that you've probably already utilized some of these techniques if you've written papers in the past, and I'm sure you have. The idea of organizing based on time or chronology makes a lot of sense, particularly if you're trying to teach somebody how to do something. You go in steps: first, then afterwards. Or you can organize based on topic and the idea that you have categories, but you aren't putting any particular weight on any of the categories. One is not necessarily more important than another. as opposed to order of importance. And in this instance, you are putting weight onto these categories, and you are either beginning with the most important element and then working your way down to the least, or perhaps you are beginning with the least important element and working your way up to the most. Both have pros and cons. If you begin with the most important or the most persuasive element, then obviously you've got your audience's attention, but you could lose your audience's attention as the speech continues. And if you were to do the opposite, obviously, if you end with the most important or the most persuasive, you leave a very lasting impression. But will you be able to hold your audience's attention while you are building up to that? You can also talk about things spatially, location. In other words, where are they in the physical realm? The example I give is if you were trying to sell a piece of real estate. Let's say you're trying to sell a house, and you as a real estate agent have quite a number of options of how to present this house to the prospective buyers. You could talk about the house from a chronological perspective, particularly if it's a very old house, so you want to talk about its history. And if it's a very new house, perhaps you want to talk about how it's new construction and no one has lived in there. If the house is about 30 years old, I don't know if chronological is necessarily the best way to present that house. Maybe you want to talk about that house in terms of topics or categories. The idea of the price point, the idea of the neighborhood, the idea of the new roof, or whatever the case may happen to be that you are selling for this house. Now, that said, some of those categories might be more important or less important depending on the individuals who are looking at the house. So individuals with children might be particularly interested in the neighborhood, while individuals without children might be more interested, let's say, in the price point. So in other words, what's most and least important can sometimes be subjective. And you basically vary or adapt your approach based on audience. So a good real estate agent will highlight or de-emphasize elements based on the individuals who are actually looking at the house. You could talk about that home also spatially, what it looks like. So when you were to enter, immediately to your left would be a living room, and right in front of you would be a small staircase that opens into a kitchen. And onto the right would be a small bedroom that could be used as a den. And on the left is a dining room. That off of the dining room there appears basically a sliding glass door for a deck. Now, you've never been into this home, but basically I'm describing what the home looks like for you. You can also talk about things causally, if they're relationships, but you have to be careful that you are identifying cause and effect, and that oftentimes is tricky. As we've seen in the political realm, if the economy is doing well, almost certainly the politician in power will take credit for that. If the economy is doing poorly, almost certainly the politician in power will say that outside forces are at play. It's probably a bit of both, but the idea of cause and effect isn't always clear. So some suggestions that I have for you about topics and how you can present these topics to your audience. Audiences tend to be interested in that which is familiar. So if you're talking about things that are part of the audience's world or experience, also, audiences tend to be engaged in questions, even if you ask a rhetorical question, a question for which there is no answer or you don't expect an answer. And this has happened in my own teaching. I remember early on in my teaching days, I was teaching a Shakespeare class about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you're familiar with the play, it happens to be about a group of lovers who fall in and out of love with one another because of a magic juice. That basically is manipulating them to fall in and out of love with one another. So because of that magic juice, one of the characters, she is the queen of the fairies, and she is the most beautiful of the beautiful. She falls in love with not just a human, but a human who's all the way at the bottom of the social scale. He's a laborer. In fact, his name is Bottom. And because of also the magic juice, he has been transformed literally into a bottom, an ass, because he acts like an ass. So even though we have the explanation of magic, there still is the question of how could such a high-order being as the queen of the fairies fall in love with Bottom, a literal and figurative ass. So I ask rhetorically to my students, well, how many of you have ever fallen in love with an ass? with the expectation that a few people might nod or chuckle, but I've actually had people answer that question. It was a rhetorical question from my perspective. I wasn't necessarily expecting an answer, but there were individuals who wanted to provide answers about their experiences with falling in love with an ass, just to show that Shakespeare is about timeless and universal concerns. So, something else you can do is present a problem and then offer a solution. This works very nicely for the persuasive speech that we will be discussing. Or also process of elimination. Talk about all of the options, and of course the remaining option is the option that you're hoping to persuade your audience to support. So that speaking outline that you're going to be writing, and it's much like note-taking in that there is no one particular way to do it. It is a very individual thing. My preference, as you can see in the videos below, is basically to use keywords and phrases where I've got categories and subcategories that I divide up by numbers. And that works very nicely for me, but that may not necessarily work nicely for you. Now, your textbook has examples of outlines, and I'm not sure which edition of the textbook you happen to be using. If you were using the edition of the textbook I had ordered for class, on page 119, there's an example of an outline on drunk drivers. Those outlines, I would say, are much too detailed to be effective for a speaking outline, because there's so much text that you would need to read the outline rather than engage with your audience, eye contact, things of that nature. So basically what you want to do is to have keywords and phrases. And if you're curious, here's my outline. And those keywords and phrases that I am looking at are the keywords and phrases that are underneath your video, so that I can glance down and know how to proceed, but I also want to maintain eye contact, whether it be with my audience or the camera or whatever the case may happen to be. The speaking outline is also a good place to list stage directions. So if you wanted to remind yourself to do something, for instance, even just taking a breath or a pause. You'll remember our last attendance question was, how do you deal with nerves? And the textbook gives you some suggestions as well. One of the biggest suggestions I have is to breathe deeply, because in fact, when we tend to be nervous, we tend to breathe very shallowly, and oftentimes don't get enough oxygen. In a time when we need to fight or flee, which would have been in the early days of our history. And I remember a self-defense class that I once took, and we were told that we should yell out the word no if we were ever attacked. And the reason why I had assumed was to attract attention to ourselves. That was secondary. The primary reason was so that we could draw oxygen into our lungs in a situation where we would probably have to either fight or flee. So taking nice deep breaths from the diaphragm is very useful. And other ways to reduce anxiety is to make sure that you're well hydrated and that you've slept well. You try to keep to your routines as much as possible. In a time where you might experience anxiety, this is not the time where you want to experiment. So I always tell students, if you've been told that you should have a big breakfast, and then you've got and you've never done it, and then you've got a big event in the morning, perhaps a job interview or perhaps an examination, that's not the day to try having a big breakfast. Your body may not respond positively to having a big breakfast, even though that's what everybody says you're supposed to do, if you've never done that before. So try it on a day where you don't have necessarily any requirements and any obligations, so that you can test out the water, so to speak. One of the best ways to reduce nervousness is just to be well prepared. In other words, to have that speaking outline, which you may not even necessarily have to refer to. Just the process of writing it out and practicing might make you familiar enough with the content so that you don't need to look at it. And I was talking about a trapeze artist, that a trapeze artist will always perform with the net. Not because they think they're going to fall into the net, they probably won't. But it's there just in case, and better safe than sorry. And I think it's very similar with the outline. You may not even necessarily have to refer to it, but it's there just in case you happen to drift or you happen to lose your place or your attention. So sometimes just being comfortable in terms of what you're wearing. That said, you want to dress respectfully for your audience, but you don't necessarily have to dress as if you were going to a job interview. This is a rather informal culture, and we are ultimately in a class, not in a real world situation. So basically, as long as you're being respectful to your audience in terms of what it is that you're wearing, but I always suggest that you don't wear something new when you are presenting a speech, because you just don't know how that clothing or those shoes will feel after you've been wearing them for a while. So you want to have some familiarity with them. Even colors might make a difference. If you tend to blush, you might feel that you should be wearing a color that tends to hide that blush, just so that you feel more self-confident. The reality is we all blush and we all show physical symptoms of nervousness. Meditation, exercise, music can be very helpful. Studies have shown that classical music in particular can help to reduce nerves, but again, if you are not a fan of classical music, that might not be the best choice. You might prefer another genre of music. Scent also can reduce anxiety. Lavender in particular has been shown to do that. Again, if you're not a fan of lavender, perhaps that's not necessarily the best option. And as you know, you also have your own ideas about reducing anxiety, and your classmates do as well. So I encourage you to read all of their responses and my responses as well to that. If you decide to use note cards, some students like note cards because they can quickly go from one point to another. I would number those note cards just in the event if you happen to drop those note cards, then you could easily put them back in order rather than spend a lot of time with trying to figure out what order they go in. I personally just like sheets of paper, but again, whatever you're comfortable with. And keep in mind that it's for your eyes. So use the font, use the size, use the color that's most comfortable for you. Now, for your speaking outlines, I am indeed going to ask you to submit in a copy of that to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, via PDF, so that I can review those and give you my suggestions based on what you've done with your outline. So when you either upload or present your speech, I'll ask you to also send your outline to me via email. And ultimately, I'm evaluating very informally, just on a checkmark system, just to make sure that you've got a sense of how to go about putting together an outline. You should try to avoid, whenever possible, delivering a speech without an outline. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And also, perhaps I can give you some suggestions or at least some practice with trying out different outlines so that you can find the system that works best for you. Again, I've shared with you the system that works best for me. There is such a thing as a sentence outline where you write out sentences of the major points that you want to cover. I think that's a little bit too cluttered, but ultimately, if that feels more comfortable to you, that's something that you can do as well. You can have what's known as the Harvard outline, which is sort of what I'm basing my outline on, where you've got categories, main points that you number, and then you've got subcategories underneath them. So there's lots of different ways that you can go about doing an outline if you wanted to do an outline that's a little bit not traditional. But keep in mind that with your speaking outline, usually less is more, so that, again, if you needed to refer to it, you could quickly find the point that you need to refer to. And it's perfectly fine to deviate from your outline, because your outline is not something that you share with your audience, so they won't know. Think of your outline as a map, if you will. So that said, I wanted to also talk about the idea of how outlines can help with memory, which is one of the reasons why you may not even need to refer to your outline, because once you've constructed it, that might help for your memory. Now, memories tend to be notoriously poor, just like we have notoriously poor listening skills because of the internal perceptual field, in that ultimately we tend to daydream, but also the external perceptual field because of our environment. Memory, too, is notoriously poor, and there have been different studies to try to gauge how much an individual can remember. It's in the area of something like plus or minus 7 items. I've seen it as low as plus or minus 3 items, which is very low indeed, because minus 3 items is 2 or 1. Now, obviously, we can remember many more items than that because we utilize techniques such as repetition. So when we keep repeating something, such as a phone number, so that we can remember it. Or mnemonics, we'll use something like a memory device. It could be an acronym, for instance, where each letter in the word stands for something. So one of the first rules of writing is KISS, which is an acronym for Keep It Simple Silly, or Keep It Simple Stupid, if you wanted to be a little bit more harsh. That the word KISS is an acronym for major points that I want to remember. This is oftentimes used in math classes and in science classes to help you remember complex pieces of information. Or even chunking, grouping like pieces of information together. Note, for instance, again, the telephone number, that we tend to think of it not as 7 digits, but 3 digits and then 4 digits. So 775-1000 is the phone number for GCC, by the way. And notice most of us probably wouldn't remember that phone number as 1000. We'd probably remember it as 1000, which is one unit rather than 4 separate units. So chunking like groups of information together can be very useful. Things like putting important information, not just in acronyms, but in song, can be very useful to memory as well. It's one of the reasons why advertising jingles work so well. It's because of the repetition and also because of the song. I think about my own experience. I have a very poor memory, remembering things like dates, remembering things like phone numbers, and yet there's one phone number I remember very clearly, 867-5309. No, that's not the phone number of a friend or a family member or even my own phone number. That happens to be the phone number of a pop song that came out in the 1980s. I respect you too much to sing the song for you. I believe the song was redone, actually. 867-5309. To think that that's taking up space in my head when there's other more important things that should be taking up space. But the mnemonic technique of the tune as well as the repetition helped to cement that into my memory. So, beginning and ending speeches. Now, obviously, the midpoint of the speech, the midsection of the speech, is the most important because that's where you've got your persuasive evidence, your details. But there is something called the primary recency effect, which is related to memory, that we tend to remember best what we hear first and last, which means that the beginning and the ending of the speech, what is first and last of the speech, is of primary importance because that's what your audience will most likely remember. So, there are techniques for beginnings and endings, introductions and conclusions. And once again, I suspect that you've utilized some of these techniques in things like writing papers. Talking about that which is real, that which is actually happening in our world, can be an effective way to begin or to end a speech. Or talking about things that are nearby to the audience can be an effective way to begin or end a speech. For instance, I think about when I'm reading the news that if I'm reading something about colleges, I'm going to be much more interested and likely to read the article because that's near and dear to me because I'm a college professor. If it's about GCC, well, that's the nearest and dearest to me, and that I will definitely read in its entirety. So things that are familiar to people tend to be engaging in introductions and conclusions, but, and this sounds like a contradiction, things that are also suspenseful are also interesting to individuals in introductions and conclusions, and things associated with conflict. Think about how the media oftentimes does that in their news stories, where they use conflict and suspense in order to draw in interest. Just stating that something is important gives it a certain level of importance in either your introduction or your conclusion. Question answer. As I had indicated, that people tend to be engaged when you ask questions, even if it's a rhetorical question. Chances are that they're supplying an answer, at least internally, if not actually doing that orally. A quotation can be an excellent technique for an introduction or a conclusion. Now, you need to find the quote, chances are, and there are lots of ways to go about that, and I know that most people just go straight to Google. I'm not necessarily averse to Google. I'm not necessarily averse to Wikipedia, but as we will discuss as the semester progresses, there are more efficient ways to search. In terms of quotations, there is a site called Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. They also have a book as well. They started as a text. One of the things about Google, as we'll discuss, is that it's basically no man's land, and that anyone can post anything. So it may be accurate or may not be accurate. But if you're going onto a reputable site, such as Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, then you know that those quotes are going to be accurate. And it's set up almost like a dictionary, in that you look up a word, the topic that you perhaps are pursuing, and then let's say you are looking up something like love, and then you would go to the L section, look up the word love, and find all kinds of quotes about love. For instance, you might find a quote that about love that was written by Shakespeare, such as "The course of true love never did run smooth," which is from A Midsummer Night's Dream. So then that quote is something that you could use, if it's relevant, in your introduction or your conclusion. You don't want to just plug in things because they're not relevant because you want length. I do remember hearing a speech once where someone began with a quote. It was a rather lengthy quote, so they had to read it, and that's fine because they wanted to get it accurate. But they didn't tell us when they started the speech that they were beginning with a quote. So our assumption was that they were going to read the entire speech, which you don't want to do because that's where you lose things like body language, eye contact, and conversationality. So in that situation, I had recommended to the student, after greeting the audience, to tell us, let me begin with a quote, so that we would know that they would be reading, but that was not going to be the entirety of that particular speech. Storytelling. People love stories. Again, beginning or ending with a story is a wonderful way to have an introduction or a conclusion. Again, the story should be relevant to the content of what you are discussing. You don't just want to insert a story because you're trying to add length in there. References to yourself. Audience members are usually interested in the speaker. So making a personal reference to yourself, something that would be appropriate, or making some sort of a startling statement. And I think I shared with you about an example of a speech given at another institution for one of my colleagues about how they were not thinking about purpose and occasion. They wanted to startle the audience by discussing their true self by disrobing, and that was not effective. But I can share with you an example that was effective in one of my own classes, and it happened to be an in-person class. It happened to be during break. And we were all coming back from break, and all of us were basically involved in our own business, and I heard from the back of the room someone beginning to choke, and time stood still at that point, where I was trying to think very quickly about what to do, about getting to that student as quickly as possible, about performing the Heimlich, about calling 911, about calling campus security. I didn't make it past my desk to get to that student before another student came, performed the Heimlich maneuver. And what came out of the choking student's mouth was a rolled ball of paper. It was quite a surreal experience. And as we all looked at that ball of paper, the person who had performed the Heimlich walked calmly to the front of the stage and took the podium and said to us that what we had just witnessed was a simulation. But if it were real, would we have been prepared to perform the Heimlich maneuver? And then the student said, today's speech is about the Heimlich maneuver. And it was brilliant because this student was scheduled to deliver their speech right after the break. They had worked it out with a friend of theirs in the class that their friend would pretend to choke. The other student would perform the Heimlich. The supposedly choking student would spit out the ball of paper, and then the speaker, who was scheduled right after the break, would come to the front of the room. So we were basically watching the beginning of the speech without realizing it. It was a wonderful way to engage the audience and motivate interest, because all of us had the same thought at exactly the same time. Did we remember how to perform the Heimlich? A speech, that topic that could be a bit dry. It was for the informative speech, but all of a sudden became so much more interesting because what we had just experienced. And yes, I'm aware that there's a certain level of risk here. Another student might have intervened the fake and gotten to the fake choking victim first. And the Heimlich performed properly can break ribs. I mean, that could have happened. Any of a number of things could have happened. But nothing happened, and I think this was a well-calculated risk in the way that they had set it all up to startle the audience. I'll never forget that speech, no matter how much time has elapsed. Even just for an intro conclusion, forecasting, in other words, telling the audience what you're going to talk about in your intro, talking about it in your body and discussion section, and then reminding us what you talked about, a summary. As I had indicated, probably repetition is something that you are going to be using more frequently in a speech because it helps with memory and you want your audience to remember what you're saying. And it also helps with listening because chances are that our listening skills aren't necessarily as good as they could be and our mind might wander. So if you repeat important pieces of information, if we missed it the first time, then there's a chance that we would get it the second time. So you're likely to repeat information more frequently when you're speaking than when you are writing. So wording your speech. This is also something that's going to be a little bit different from the writing. Because when you're writing something, then you want to try to be as precise as possible with your language. And you have the time to do that. You don't when you are speaking. Yes, you do have the time to prepare when you are going to be delivering a speech, certainly. But you are presenting a speech in the oral style, not the written style. So what does an oral style mean? It means it's much more conversational. You're using simpler vocabulary. You're using shorter sentences. And it's much less formal. So when you are putting together a speaking outline or when you are putting together just some ideas for your speech, keep in mind what the Toastmaster video recommended to you, that you don't want to memorize your speech. And I also agree with that. You don't want to worry about precise language. You want to worry about the concepts that you are going to be sharing with your audience. And then you can think about the language in the moment so that it appears much more spontaneous. So think about it as if you were preparing for an important conversation. I think I had mentioned something to the effect of asking for a raise, for instance, at work. You wouldn't be reading off of a script, but chances are you've rehearsed that conversation, not memorized it, but rehearsed it so that you have an idea of the points you want to cover. And of course, your employer is going to respond, and then that means you're going to have to think on your feet based on their response. Though you can always prepare somewhat and trying to anticipate what their response is and what your response might be in turn. So it's very similar to that sort of idea. Now I wanted to talk about language in terms of definitions because we usually think about a definition in terms of its denotation or dictionary definition. However, you also need to think about definitions in terms of their connotations or their associations. In other words, two words can have the same dictionary definition, but two very different associations associated with it. So the dictionary definition or the denotation of cheap and frugal, very similar. You don't spend a lot of money. But the connotations or the associations are quite different in that cheap is seen as much more negative, frugal is seen as much more positive. So cheap is viewed as stingy, and the idea of frugal is that one is being intelligent and mindful with one's money. They mean the same thing, but the associations are quite different. Again, think about how advertisers and marketers are quite careful about the language they use, not just the denotation, but the connotation or the associations behind them. So, when you think about some of the language that we use in our everyday speaking, you can talk about a used car or you can talk about a pre-owned vehicle. Both mean the same thing, but a pre-owned vehicle sounds much better than a used car, which oftentimes has negative associations with it. And then there's some euphemisms that we use quite regularly, and they become part of our language. When we talk about going to the restroom, chances are we aren't resting. Or if we're going to the powder room, chances are we aren't powdering. But even bathroom, chances are 9 out of 10 times you're not using the bath, but that's the language that we use so that we're not quite as explicit when we say the toilet room. However, there are other euphemisms that we might use in order to deceive or misrepresent, and you want to be careful with that. So something like genuine imitation leather. There is no such thing as a genuine imitation leather. An imitation is an imitation. But again, oftentimes advertisers will utilize language like that to try to manipulate and deceive. And we had talked about ethos or ethics, so that you want to be careful or at least mindful of the language that you're using. And usually when we talk about definitions, we talk about what something is. We can use a negative definition, which is what something is not. So, for instance, when you're defining what a word is not, I might share with you that the word rich, I don't mean wealthy in terms of financial resources. I mean wealthy in terms of health and happiness. So, in other words, I've just given you a definition of what, for me, rich is not. It's not about money, it's about something else. So, and that's also another way that you could proceed with a speech. And think about how definitions are dependent on context, a contextual definition, determined by the situation, how it's used. So when I say brief, I'm probably talking about something that's concise, because I'm talking about public speaking or I'm talking about writing. However, if this were a fashion class and I was talking about brief, I'm probably talking about an article of clothing. If this were a law class, I'm probably talking about a report, a brief. So the situation can oftentimes determine the definition and the understanding of what a word means. And then there are many advanced techniques in terms of delivering speeches with language. We're at the very beginning where we're trying to remember to breathe deeply and to greet our audience and to say farewell to our audience. But you can utilize things like imagery, which is very sensory, where it assists with visualization. This is a very literary technique, as well as metaphor, when you are comparing two dissimilar things and showing the similarity between them without using like or as. If you use like or as, then and that's called a simile rather than a metaphor. I do remember a practice speech I once heard called I Am Red. And this was a great metaphor for an autobiographical speech where this student was claiming that they were literally the color red, that they weren't like the color red, but they were red. And that they talked about associations with red, the color, that would also be associations that would be applicable to their character. Things like passion and danger. And that worked very well until eventually they started to lose focus, what I call tap dancing a little bit too much. And when they started talking about the terminals in a car battery, it became a little bit more difficult to follow what it was that they were saying. So you need to be careful when you're using things like a metaphor or you're using imagery where something is supposed to represent something else. Usually something concrete is used to represent something that is non-concrete, that is abstract. Think about how a flag is used as a symbol for patriotism. The flag is a concrete image, and patriotism is much more subjective. So when we think about the very best speeches, and in fact there have been rankings of speeches, and perhaps not surprisingly, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream usually appears at the top of the list as perhaps the best speech ever given in these rankings by scholars and individuals associated with rhetoric, because it's a wonderful example of a speech that also is literary, that uses imagery and metaphor and simile and rhyme and also alliteration. Rhyme is when the word endings have similar sounds. Alliteration is when the word beginnings have similar sound. And certainly we can all aspire to that kind of greatness when we're delivering a speech. But again, we don't necessarily have to reach that level of greatness when we are delivering a speech. The point of delivering a speech is communicating with your audience. So as long as you're able to communicate your message clearly, that's really what you're aiming for. And then when you become comfortable doing that, and next class we'll start talking about elements such as eye contact and body language and so forth. Once you become getting comfortable doing that, then you can begin thinking about some of the finer points of language. And keep in mind that your language should be audience-centered. It should be appropriate for your audience. So think about how if you were speaking to an audience of children, chances are your language would be very different than if you were speaking to an audience of adults. You assume a greater level of sophistication and freedom with adults than you would with children. And you want to try to use neutral terms because language can be very powerful. You want to try to be culturally sensitive. And pronouns in particular, especially over the last few years, have come under scrutiny. In the past, the pronoun he was used to basically represent all genders. So the idea was to change the he to he and she, or perhaps just to turn it into a plural, they, and then you didn't have to get into sticky questions of which pronoun to use first, he or she, so that you aren't showing preference when you say something like a doctor should examine his patients, which perhaps might suggest that all doctors are male, or a doctor should examine her patients, which might suggest that you are preferencing the male because the his goes before the her. But as you know, there have been quite a few conversations over the last several years about the idea of whether or not things can be quite that simple as a division of he or she. And is gender quite that binary? So the pronoun they has become increasingly used to represent not just groups of individuals, but also singulars as well. What I say about all of this is that what you want to try to do is be sensitive. You don't necessarily need to be perfect. And I know that in my own language, I make all kinds of mistakes. I do so almost daily when I ask if the mailman has come. And I know very well I should ask if the postal carrier has come, because mailman basically is limited to a particular gender. And that's even more problematic when the postal carrier is female. However, that's the first thing that comes out of my mouth. If I were in trouble, I suspect the first thing I would do is yell for a policeman. I know I should be asking for a police officer. But I need to communicate my message quickly and clearly, so that's probably what would come out. So what I suggest to public speakers is to try to be sensitive, not to try to necessarily be perfect. Again, you don't want to get so entangled in language that you aren't able to communicate meaning, which is what the whole point is. And sometimes drawing attention to things, a mistake you might have made in your language, can make things worse rather than better. And this is also in reference to content. So if I had given you the wrong date, I might have tried to correct myself. But if I continue through correcting myself to continue to give you wrong dates, then not only are you hyper aware that I made a mistake, but now you're beginning to wonder if I have any sense of what the day is. So I've made things worse rather than better, rather than just let the error go where most people would assume, oh, she just gave the wrong date. So again, it's less about being precise in your language, and it's more about being able to communicate meaning. You want to try to be conversational when you're speaking. Again, it's quite the opposite when you're writing. So for today's attendance question, because those are the three things that I wanted to cover today, I thought I would ask you about speech number 1, because that specifically is what we are preparing for, speech number 1. Next class, we will be talking about delivering speeches, public speaking and cultural challenges, and understanding your audience. I'll talk also a little bit more about our upcoming quiz, which will be next Thursday on the 28th, which will be based on the first chapters that we've discussed in class, and also finding a way to reach out to me for practice, even if it just be an email with you telling me what it is that you're planning on talking about for your speech. That would be perfectly fine. Or to the other extreme, which is actually delivering your speech to me as a practice speech and getting my feedback, or anything in between. And of course, if you are thinking about using Zoom, you need to contact me, because as of this point, I believe, unless someone has changed their mind, everyone is going to be uploading their speech on the 2nd, which is perfectly fine. But again, if you wanted to deliver via Zoom, I needed to find the time in which we could all do that. So today's attendance question, which will be due Saturday the 24th, and again, if you need additional time, please let me know. What do you think your biggest challenge will be delivering speech number 1, and why? What do you think your biggest challenge will be delivering speech number 1, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.